He walked into CIA headquarters holding an orchid. Months later, American intelligence began to collapse from within. They called him the savior of the West, but one question kept growing louder. Was he actually the most cunning enemy to ever infiltrate the system? Why did he demand meetings only at the highest level? Why did he bring flowers every time? And was it true that he named dozens of top agents, but never gave real proof? One man, one suitcase of documents, and a decade of spying on his own allies. Because of his claims, careers were destroyed, allies turned against each other, and entire governments fell under suspicion. He used no weapons, only words, hints, and fear, and no one ever truly figured out whose side he was on. The real truth only reveals itself at the very end. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. The Helsinki snow crunched beneath his feet as Major Anatoly Golitsyn walked toward his date with history. December winds cut through the Finnish capital, but the chill he felt came from something deeper than weather. Behind him lay 15 years of service to the KGB. Ahead waited an uncertain future in a country whose language he barely spoke. Galiten knew the Americans would be skeptical. Defectors came and went, some genuine, others carrying carefully crafted deceptions. But what he possessed in those two battered suitcases would change everything. Names, methods, networks that stretched across continents like invisible spiderwebs. The meeting itself was almost comically simple. His broken English failed him completely, so he pushed a crumpled piece of paper across the table. One word, hastily scrawled, asylum. The American operative stared at the note, then at this nervous Soviet official who claimed to hold secrets worth more than gold. Within 72 hours, the Galiten family found themselves in Stockholm, then Washington. The speed of their extraction spoke volumes about American interest. This wasn't just another walk-in defector. This was potentially the intelligence coup of the decade, but Galiten came with peculiar habits. He refused to be photographed. He insisted on bringing orchids to every meeting with his handler. Most strangely, he demanded audiences with the highest levels of American government, claiming his information was too sensitive for anyone below presidential level. The Americans assigned him to James Jesus Angleton, the legendary chief of CIA counterintelligence. Angleton was known throughout the agency as a brilliant but paranoid operative who saw Soviet schemes behind every shadow. The pairing of these two suspicious minds would prove either inspired or catastrophic. To understand what happened next, you must step into the mindset of 1961. This was an era before satellite imagery revealed every secret, before internet communications made intelligence gathering routine. Every photograph, every intercepted message, every human source represented precious fragments in an enormous puzzle. The nuclear balance hung by threads. America had briefly held atomic supremacy after 1945, but Soviet bombs had restored equilibrium by 1949. Now both sides possessed weapons capable of ending civilization, yet neither fully understood their opponent's true capabilities or intentions. Space had become the new frontier of competition. When Moscow launched the first artificial satellite in 1957, American confidence shattered. If the Soviets could put objects into orbit, they could potentially drop nuclear warheads anywhere on Earth. The technological gap felt both real and terrifying. Paranoia reached absurd levels. When Premier Khrushchev offered President Eisenhower puppies from Laika, the space dog, American security officials refused to allow them into the White House. They suspected the innocent animals might contain listening devices. Trust had become a luxury neither side could afford. Into this atmosphere of mutual suspicion walked Anatoly Golitsyn. He promised to reveal not just individual Soviet agents, but entire networks that had supposedly penetrated Western intelligence services. For James Angleton, whose worldview was built on the assumption that communist infiltration ran deeper than anyone imagined, Galiten seemed like vindication incarnate. The defector's timing was impeccable. Relations between Washington and Moscow had recently soured after the U-2 incident over Soviet territory. Francis Gary Powers, the captured American pilot, had revealed more than just spy plane capabilities. His interrogation exposed American intelligence methods and targets, forcing both sides to reassess their operations. What Galiten revealed next would have sounded like science fiction to anyone outside the intelligence world. He claimed the Soviet Union operated not one, but two separate intelligence services. The official KGB was merely a front. Behind it lurked a second, more secretive organization that had supposedly placed agents throughout Western governments and intelligence agencies. According to Golitsyn, this shadow KGB had achieved something unprecedented in espionage history. They had not just recruited isolated agents, but had systematically penetrated the highest levels of Allied intelligence services. British MI6, French intelligence, even the CIA itself had supposedly been compromised by this invisible enemy. The defector's claims grew more spectacular with each meeting. He insisted that Soviet agents held positions of authority throughout the Western intelligence community. These weren't just low-level informants passing along occasional secrets. These were decision-makers who could influence policy, misdirect investigations, and protect other Soviet assets. Angleton absorbed these revelations with growing excitement. Here was confirmation of his deepest suspicions about Soviet penetration. The paranoid counterintelligence chief had always believed that Moscow's reach extended further than his colleagues imagined. Galiten offered not just validation, but a roadmap for rooting out the hidden enemy. The hunt began immediately. Angleton launched what became known as the Slavic purge, a systematic investigation of CIA employees with Eastern European backgrounds or connections. Agents found themselves under surveillance in their own agency. Polygraph tests became routine. Phone calls were monitored, homes were searched, careers were destroyed based on suspicion alone. Dozens of experienced intelligence officers found themselves cast out of the CIA without evidence of wrongdoing. Their only crime was falling under suspicion in Galiten's expanding web of accusations. The defector demanded $15 million to establish a special counterintelligence unit under his guidance. Remarkably, Angleton agreed. Understanding what happened next requires examining the psychological landscape of both men. Galiten had spent his career in a system built on suspicion and betrayal. Soviet intelligence officers learned to trust no one completely, to see hidden meanings in every gesture, to assume that today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. His background offered few clues about his true motivations. Born into a middle-class family, he had risen through KGB ranks without distinguishing himself particularly. Colleagues described him as arrogant and ambitious, someone who resented his relatively modest position within the intelligence hierarchy. Some whispered that his defection might have been motivated as much by wounded pride as by ideological conversion. James Angleton presented an equally complex psychological profile. The son of American parents living in Italy, he had absorbed European sophistication and American ambition in equal measure. His friendship with British intelligence officer Kim Philby, later revealed as a Soviet agent, had scarred him deeply. The betrayal taught him that anyone could be an enemy in disguise. Their partnership created a feedback loop of mutual reinforcement. Golitsyn would present new theories about Soviet penetration, and Angleton would find ways to investigate them. When evidence failed to support the defectors' claims, both men interpreted this as proof of how deeply the conspiracy ran. Absence of evidence became evidence of absence in their twisted logic. The defectors' peculiar habits only strengthened Angleton's belief in his authenticity. Who but a genuine Soviet officer would refuse photographs and insist on bringing orchids to meetings? These quirks seemed too strange to be fabricated, too personal to be part of an elaborate deception. But there were warning signs that both men chose to ignore. Golitsyn's English remained poor throughout his years in America, yet he refused interpreters, claiming that anyone who spoke Russian might be a Soviet agent. His spending habits were erratic. He would demand large sums from the CIA, then reportedly run naked through New York streets when the money ran out. Golitsyn's influence extended far beyond American intelligence. In 1962, he convinced Angleton that Soviet penetration had infected Allied services as well. The defector and his family flew to London, where British intelligence officers granted him access to thousands of classified documents. His conclusions about British politics were startling. Golitsyn claimed that the KGB had poisoned Hugh Gaitskell, leader of the Labour Party, to ensure that Harold Wilson would become Prime Minister. According to the defector, Wilson was himself a Soviet agent who had been positioned to lead Britain toward policies favorable to Moscow. The accusations against Wilson were never proven, but they destroyed the Prime Minister's relationship with American intelligence. For years, British-American cooperation suffered under clouds of suspicion that originated in Golitsyn's fevered imagination. The defector had succeeded in weakening the Western alliance without firing a shot. His targets expanded to include Canadian leadership and French government officials. President Kennedy, acting on CIA recommendations, sent a warning to Charles de Gaulle about supposed intelligence leaks from NATO bases in France. The French leader, insulted by these implications, eventually withdrew France from NATO's integrated command structure. Each new accusation created diplomatic rifts between allies. Golitsyn had discovered that he could cause enormous damage simply by pointing fingers and making unsubstantiated claims. Whether this was his original intention or simply a byproduct of his paranoid worldview remains unclear. The pattern was always the same. The defector would study classified documents, then emerge with shocking claims about high-level Soviet penetration. Investigations would follow, relationships would be damaged, but concrete evidence of the alleged agents was never found. Yet instead of questioning Golitsyn's reliability, his handlers interpreted these failures as proof of how sophisticated the Soviet conspiracy had become. The paranoia that Golitsyn helped cultivate within American intelligence eventually turned inward. In 1967, the CIA launched Operation Chaos, a massive domestic surveillance program targeting American citizens who had traveled abroad or expressed dissenting political views. The operation, partly justified by fears of Soviet influence among anti-war protesters, eventually compiled files on over 300,000 Americans. Democratic Party leadership civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had criticized government policy found themselves under surveillance by their own intelligence services. This domestic spying operation violated the CIA's charter, which restricted the agency to foreign intelligence gathering. But the atmosphere of suspicion that Golitsyn had helped create made such violations seem necessary for national security. If Soviet agents really had penetrated American society at every level, then extraordinary measures were justified. The program remained secret until the Watergate scandal forced broader investigations of government surveillance activities. When congressional committees finally examined Operation Chaos, they discovered the extent to which American intelligence had turned against its own citizens. The revelation contributed to President Nixon's downfall and led to major reforms of intelligence oversight. Golitsyn's influence on this domestic surveillance program was indirect but significant. His constant warnings about invisible Soviet networks had created an atmosphere where any dissent could be interpreted as foreign manipulation. The defector had helped transform American counterintelligence from a shield against foreign enemies into a weapon against domestic opposition. By 1973, the intelligence community had grown tired of endless witch hunts and inconclusive investigations. William Colby, the new CIA director, represented a different philosophy of intelligence work. He believed in measurable results and accountability rather than paranoid speculation. Colby's reforms were swift and decisive. He dismissed numerous officers associated with the previous era of internal suspicion. James Angleton, the architect of countless failed mole hunts, was forced into retirement. And Anatoly Golitsyn, the defector whose accusations had dominated CIA counterintelligence for over a decade, was cut loose from his lucrative consulting relationship. The defector didn't go quietly. He demanded continued access to classified materials, insisting that he alone understood the true scope of Soviet penetration. When these requests were denied, he turned to writing books that recycled his old theories for public consumption. His memoirs repeated the same unsubstantiated claims that had once paralyzed American intelligence. After leaving government service, Golitsyn changed his name again and disappeared into American suburban anonymity. He settled in a modest house outside New York City, living quietly with his wife and daughter. The man who had once commanded the attention of presidents and prime ministers became just another retired immigrant with stories that few people wanted to hear. He passed away in 2008, taking his secrets with him. Before his final illness, he reportedly begged his wife to keep the details of his life hidden from the world. Whether this request stemmed from shame, fear, or simple desire for privacy, no one can say with certainty. The mystery of Anatoly Golitsyn remains unsolved. Was he a genuine defector who sacrificed everything to warn the West about Soviet infiltration? Or was he the most successful double agent in espionage history, a man who crippled American intelligence while appearing to help it? The damage he caused is undeniable. Careers were destroyed, alliances were weakened, and American intelligence spent years chasing shadows instead of focusing on real threats. Whether this destruction was intentional or simply the byproduct of two paranoid minds feeding off each other may never be known. What remains clear is that the Cold War produced many casualties beyond those who died in proxy conflicts. Trust itself became a casualty, sacrificed on the altar of absolute security. In trying to protect themselves from invisible enemies, Western intelligence services nearly destroyed themselves from within. The orchids that Golitsyn brought to his meetings were beautiful flowers, But orchids are also parasites that survive by drawing nutrients from other plants. Perhaps that detail, more than any elaborate theory about his true loyalties, captures the essence of his relationship with American intelligence. In the end, the most successful intelligence operations are often the simplest ones. A man appears with secrets and orchids. He tells his handlers what they want to hear, confirms their deepest fears, and validates their existing prejudices. And slowly, methodically, he helps them tear their own organization apart from within. The Cold War is over, but its lessons about paranoia and betrayal remain relevant. In any conflict built on secrets and suspicion, the greatest enemy might not be the obvious opponent across the ideological divide. Sometimes the most dangerous threat comes from those who claim to be your greatest allies, bearing gifts of information and beautiful flowers that mask a deeper poison.